8. Power and authority. St. Paul, in reminding the Corinthian Christians of their destiny, said, "Do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world?" 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2. Moffat renders this, "Do you not know that the saints are to manage the world?" A meaning we need to remind ourselves of. Church government is a prelude to world government, not by the church, but by the saints. In trying to establish the necessary church government towards this end, Paul's constant appeal was not to the form of church government or to the members, but to the laws of God and the growth of the saints in terms of it. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15 to chapter 9, verse 27. Judging, governing, or managing of the world is in terms of God's law. When St. Paul expressed indignation at the idea of Christians going to a Roman court, he was speaking as a good Jew in the tradition of the law. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10. To go to an outside court was forbidden in Israel, under normal circumstances, in problems between Jews. In such instances, resorts was had to Jewish courts, a tradition of law maintained to this day in many circles. Similarly, St. Paul felt that, between believers, the church authorities are constituted the governing body. Between a Jew and a Gentile, or between a Christian and a non-Christian, there could be a legitimate use of the outside or civil courts. These courts, not being governed by God's law, were therefore not trustworthy agencies of justice. Let us turn now to Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus returned home after many years of wandering. During that time, it had not occurred to him that chastity might be required of him, although he expected it of his wife and slave girls. The suitors of his wife, for Odysseus was presumed dead, raped some of these slave girls. Odysseus himself acknowledged this. "Ye dogs, you said in your hearts that I should never more come home from the land of the Trojans, in that ye wasted my house, and lay with the maidservants by force, and traitorously wooed my wife while I was yet alive." The nurse Eurycleia said that 12 of his 50 slave girls were involved. "Of these 12 in all have gone the way of shame, and honour not me, nor their lady Penelope." After killing the suitors, Odysseus and his son Telemachus and others turned to the girls to execute them. Telemachus hung all 12 on one cable. The reason for the execution was stated by Telemachus. "These have poured dishonour on my head and on my mother, and have lain with the wooers." The offence of the girls was not against God, it was against Odysseus and Telemachus. The involvement of these girls with the men who had raped them, or perhaps seduced them, was not as important as the dishonour felt by Odysseus and Telemachus. Law, for them, had no higher reach than themselves. The girls were property. The disposal of property was then, as now, a matter of expediency, not of right and wrong. The same was true in early Rome. The father had power over his children. They were property. Law did not transcend man, and it was essentially limited to the family of man. Subsequently, the state took over the family's powers and made itself the father of its people and the source of law. In either case, law was essentially humanistic and man-centered. Since man as family head or man as status leader issued the law was total. This appeared very clearly in Plato's Laws. The principal thing is that none, man or woman, should ever be without an officer set over him, and that none should get the mental habit of taking any step, whether in earnest or in jest, on his individual responsibility. In a word, we must train the mind not even to consider acting as an individual or know how to do it. If no law of God exists, man's humanistic alternatives, when pressed to their logical conclusions, mean either anarchism or totalitarian statism. Brophy's comment on the Leopold and Loeb case is revealing at this point. What emerges from reading an account of the case is a failure, or rather a confusion on the part of society, which, in all its dealings with Leopold and Loeb, in their education and in what accounted to their father's education, their trial, never offered them any reason why they should not murder or why they should feel remorse. What it did offer them was God, and they saw through him. He gave up the idea that there was a God, states one of the medical reports in Leopold, saying that if a God exists, some pre-God must have created him. In this line of thinking, he reasons by analogy. Having been taught that the moral law drew its sanction from God, the young men were simply being logical in concluding that to jettison God was to jettison the moral law as well. Indeed, this, in society's eyes, was their crime, or at least the crime of Leopold, the more intelligent of the two, he reasoned. And, having worked out his position by reason, he could not be induced to change it under emotional pressure from the threat of death. As the medical report records, he stated that consistency has always been a sort of god to him. Society could make nothing of Leopold except to classify him as abnormal, by which it meant that he was a nonconformer in his sexual tastes, his very imagination. Anarchism or totalitarianism, these are the alternatives. Either people after Plato's hope, who do not even consider acting as an individual or know how to do it, or individuals who are an absolute law unto themselves, these are the alternatives humanism offers to man. But the saints are to govern the world in terms of God's law, which means that they must know that law. Thus, a basic requirement of healthy church life is a constant study of God's law, its implications and its applications. The question of authority is inseparable from law in any biblical sense. A primary meaning of authority is the right to command and enforce obedience, the right to act officially. The origin of authority is a Latin word, augeo, increase. Authority has a natural increase to it. True authority prospers and abounds. Power and authority are not identical words. Power is strength or force. Power can and often does exist without authority. The power of Odysseus and Telemachus and the powers of the Roman Empire were real powers, but, in terms of God's law, they lacked authority, although they had a formal authority merely as legitimate governments in their societies. As Denis de Rougemont pointed out, one does not become a father by stealing a child. One can steal a child, not paternity. One can steal power, not authority. The Church must, by its faithfulness to the law word of God, establish, strengthen, and increase its authority. Its power will increase. St. Paul indicated to the Corinthians as Christians obey the law of God, and as the Church applies it to its internal affairs, and as it calls upon its member citizens to apply it to the world around them. The ground of this increased power is Jesus Christ, who declared, "All power is given unto me, in heaven and in earth." Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. As the absolute possessor of all power, he is the predestinating source of all immediate power. He is also the perfect coincidence of power and authority. In the school of history, the Church is held back, rebuked, and humbled whenever its power ceases to be grounded in the authority of Christ's law word, or wherever its authority seeks support in other lords than Christ. The Church is required to teach all men and nations to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Matthew chapter 28, verse 20. His presence and his power undergird those who teach the observance of all that Christ commands. Power, when divorced from godly authority, becomes progressively demonic. Authority can be legitimate in a human sense, resting on succession or election, and yet be immoral and hostile to God's order. Thus, the authority of Nero was somewhat legitimate, and Christians were required to obey him. But his authority was ungodly and implicitly and explicitly satanic in its development. True order requires that both power and authority be godly in their nature and application. Some of the aspects of this problem can be best illustrated by the report of an able and thoughtful Christian who suddenly realized that his daydreams were probably satanic. He dreamed of having enough power to eliminate by execution all traitors and communists, and to have all Americans miraculously turned into converts. In his thinking, he gave assent to Christ. In his imagination, he was asking Christ to submit to Satan's temptation. He wanted to compel belief by miracles. Matthew chapter 5, verses 5 to 7. And to provide security from problems miraculously. Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 4. Then he raised a very discerning question. Is the alternative merely the way of conversion and love, without any law, order, and coercion, and without miracles, or do miracles, laws, and coercion somehow have a place? To answer this question, let us first look at Matthew chapter 13, verse 58, which tells us that in his own country, Nazareth, Matthew chapter 13, verse 54, Jesus did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. It is a serious error to say that Jesus' power to perform miracles was conditional upon faith on the person's or the audience's part. His power was entirely from himself, by virtue of his deity. It was not in any sense dependent on the response of the people. There had to be, thus, another reason for the limited number of miracles performed in Nazareth. Some were performed, although apparently not publicly, for we are told that he did not many mighty works, which implies some were done. The miracles were never performed to convert people. The demand of the scribes and Pharisees for a sign specifically aimed at compelling them to belief, or rather, at making faith unnecessary because of sight, was rejected by Jesus. Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 to 45, chapter 16, verses 1 to 4. The purpose of the miracles was to glorify God, and the reaction of faith to the miracles was to glorify God also. Mark chapter 2, verse 12. There is thus a very important place in the life of the converted person for miraculous and providential help from God. It is an aspect of His governing care. Similarly, there is a place for coercion. Justice and law require it. They are futile, however, without a basis in a people of faith who can maintain and develop a social order. If tomorrow all the internal and external enemies of the United States were miraculously destroyed, the major results would be the further decline and decay of American life. There would then be the freedom to sin with impunity, insofar as historical consequences are concerned. If all, or almost all Americans were at the same time miraculously converted, the evil would be compounded. The point of the daydream was humanistic. Its purpose was national peace and freedom. Had it been international peace and freedom, the humanism would have been no less real. The chief end of such a dream is human order and man's peace. It is thus a variation of the social gospel. The primary purpose of conversion is that man be reconciled to God. Reconciliation with his fellow man and with himself is a secondary aspect of this fact, a necessary byproduct, but still a byproduct. The purpose of regeneration is that man reconstruct all things in conformity to God's order, not in terms of man's desire for peace. This purpose and mission involves law and coercion. Regeneration is God's sovereign act in terms of His sovereign purpose. It is coercive in that it is God's act, and yet, because man himself is God's act, regeneration is not coercive in that it comes as a climax to God's work within man's heart. Neither conversions nor miracles are man's work. For man to seek forced conversions or miracles in terms of his own hopes is wrong. Man can require obedience to God's law, but he cannot play God. Where power and true authority are together, there man does not play God. He serves God in terms of his law, and he prays to God. Power and authority are used to further godly order, not human hopes of order. God's order required the fall of Rome, not its peace. Many Christians prayed for Rome, and rightfully so. They sinned when they limited God's work to the framework of the empire.